Let's get going. It's 9 o'clock. Keith, are we on? So, good morning, everybody. Everyone gathered here on site at All Saints Church. Everyone streaming us from around Southern California, across the country, and around the world. Good to see all of you here. My name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the rector, the senior pastor here at All Saints Church. And just deeply grateful to have, it's like the best thing I can call you. I'll give you, this is my friend, Ken Chasen, who is the senior rabbi at Baeck Temple. And he also has an IMDb page, so check that out.
Previous life.
That's right. And so, without, you were so gracious when I first came here to reach out to me and to Robin and really embrace us, and that's been wonderful. And since October 7th, it's like there's not even a word for it. And I've been so deeply grateful for your willingness to lean into our relationship. And just so first of all, just thank you for that. Thank you for being here. And can we welcome Ken Chasen? And the first thing I want to start with is, because I'm going to have you sort of tell about yourself and things like that, but we're within 48 hours of Iran launching hundreds of missiles at Israel. And how are you? How is your congregation doing? Just like, how's your heart right now? What's
Grateful for the question.
Yeah.
The answer is there's a lot of heart heaviness, a lot of anxiety. Most of us at Baeck have either family or friends or both living in Israel. A number of our congregants are traveling and are visiting there now, so we have members of our congregation who are there as this is taking place. So there's a tremendous amount of heart heaviness and anxiety about what comes next. And I sent a message out late last night to the congregation affirming the myriad of emotions that I think people are experiencing right now, lifting up how moments like this, I stayed entirely away from the geopolitics of the matter because I don't actually really believe that our congregation has gotten there yet. You know, when you're watching the images that we were watching on television yesterday, there is a primary reaction that I believe ultimately it has that underbelly of fear, which we know can produce the worst in us. But there's also a deep humanity that rises and kind of flies above the geopolitics. And I think that's certainly where I was and am today in the aftermath of yesterday, and I believe where most of our community was. And so I spoke to how really the great Jewish heroes in all of Jewish history are those who have managed to lift up humanity even in the darkest hours of the human story. And we want to be among those, even while recognizing that we have no idea what's coming next other than good reason to be fairly certain that it will be worse. And preparing for worse when you know that it's coming and you don't know what it is deeply unsettled. I'm sure you're every bit as unsettled by the prospect of that as we are.
Have you been in touch with your own family and friends over there?
Yes.
And
spent the whole day, yesterday afternoon and evening was mostly about reaching out to family, friends, colleagues of mine who lead communities there. And yeah, everybody's terribly rattled. Thank God everybody's safe, at least for now. But there's considerable anxiety about all the uncertainty of what comes next.
Yeah. And something we were just talking about before, it's one thing, like, for example, how I encounter this, which is really conceptual. I have no experience of what it's like to huddle in a bomb shelter. You know, my father did during World War II, and I know his stories. But I would think that, many of us in America have no idea what it actually physically feels like in our
Yeah.
bodies.
Yeah.
To have, and yet, you know what that's like. Your family knows what that's like.
Yeah.
There's a traumatic reality to that. And then I imagine, so tell me if I'm right, I imagine that because there are quite a few members of your congregation who have shared that experience or shared that fear from other family members, that anything like this that happens, much less 300 missiles, is triggering a lot of trauma, is activating a lot of trauma in the congregation. And so is that, so what's...
Yeah, that I think becomes the challenge as you go forward into the weeks and months ahead and walking around, looking, our work as pastors, what I have found, if you boil this down to take the global situation out, you think about illness, injury, loss, the experiences that I have been constantly amazed by the resilience of human beings in facing awful. Mm-hmm. I'm just amazed constantly. Congregants who get a horrible diagnosis, prognosis is a disaster, and they put on their helmet and they go and they live their lives. The one thing that I think I have seen again and again that unglues people is looming uncertainty. When you're waiting for the news, I took the tests, but we haven't gotten the results back yet. And one possibility is this awful prognosis. Mm-hmm. But one possibility is I might be okay. How do you avoid going to that place of utter disaster and torture yourself with the concept of it? It's like a bar mitzvah kid in the little room before they walk out into the bima to lead the service. I'm like, you are feeling the worst you will feel today right now. Yeah. I promise you, you will be less nervous the minute you walk out onto the bima and open your mouth for the first time, because the prospect of the things that frighten us is actually worse than the experience itself. And so that is what I'm kind of gripping for. I think you're right. There's a lot of re-traumatization that's taking place, certainly for those of us who have been in Israel during other times of conflict, who know what the inside of a bomb shelter looks and feels like, who know what it's like when those sirens go off and you recognize you're on a time-limited race to get yourself to safety. A lot of us know what that experience is like. But even for those, you're right, who are experiencing it vicariously with family members, friends, teachers, that wound is being ripped open by all of this. I am more concerned, at the moment, it is a healing mission to stand with people in their angst. As things go forward, I think that waiting for the prognosis to come in, uncertainty, is going to have its own toxicity, really, for all of us.
Well, and as you describe that, my mind immediately goes to looking at the coming election cycle in this country, and in some ways, we're all living in this space before that happens or while this happens.
That's right.
And so it becomes looming uncertainty on top of looming uncertainty.
That's right.
And, I notice I've found sort of a major spike in people acting out emotionally. Yeah. And I don't blame them. Yeah. I mean, I want to sometimes.
That's right.
And it is why it's so important to do the work that you're doing pastoring your community. And so thank you so much for that. Let's step back a little, get a little lighter, and then we'll sort of move back in. We've gotten to know each other well, and I think a lot of folks who've been here at All Saints for a while know you, but just can you sort of reintroduce yourself to the All Saints community? What are your, why did you become a rabbi? What are your passions? Tell us about the life of Leo Baeck Temple.
Yeah, so I first became a adjunct parishioner of All Saints Church in 2003 when I came to be senior rabbi at Leo Baeck. It was Rabbi Bierman, Alav HaShalom, blessed memory, who really introduced me, he and his family, to the church, along with Ed Bacon and George Rikas, blessed memory. Both of them extended the kind of warm welcome that it was my honor to pass along when you first came to town. Being here at the church over the years has been an extraordinary source of fellowship and love and inspiration. My story as a rabbi, you're right about the IMDb thing, but don't waste your time. It's really not all that exciting. I used to make my living writing music for television and film. That was what I did when I first graduated college. I moved out to LA. I was born in the middle of the country, Chicago. Spent the first half of my childhood in the North Shore suburbs of Chicago. moved to Kansas City for the back half of my childhood, went to college in Ohio, so I was a Midwesterner through and through, and came out to California specifically to pursue my first career. Had an amazing run. I basically spent my 20s editing scores and doing a lot of songwriting, mostly for TV shows, a little bit of film work, mostly TV. And it was a thrill. I was a Midwestern kid. I was working on what's now the Sony Pictures lot in Culver City, and going to the commissary for lunch every day, and standing in line with all the people who you know, and then to get my sandwich, and then going to the control room on the scoring stage and watching John Williams conduct the score for Prince of Tides as my lunch break. It was a great chapter of my life. I wouldn't give those years back for anything. And I found myself, in the early going, I was young and stupid. I was 21 years old, I graduated college. I just kind of assumed I'm either going to make it in the entertainment industry and that's my life, or I'm going to fail at my attempt and I'm going to go do something else. And I didn't realize that there would be a third spot in there, where I could actually make it in that business, and I could choose to spend my life doing that, or I could say, I'm glad I did that and I have other interests and hungers that are lying dormant, while that musical part of myself was being deeply exercised and satisfied. And so that's what happened. I was missing a lot of other parts of myself, including my faith, but so much of it was this. For those of you who work in the entertainment industry, I was in one union as a musician, another union as an editor of music, and still another union when I was mixing music. It really is like a big money, highly creative factory. And my job was to put the music widget on as the car rolled by on the assembly line. And so that part of me was getting exercise all the time, but I had a home studio in my apartment and a studio on the lot, and I was mostly alone creating music all the time. It was wonderful. That part was wonderful. The alone part, not so great. And I became attracted to not only a life that would enable me to serve as this work does, but that would immerse me with other people, that enable me both in large space and in intimate space to be doing more relational work, and that the music could be a large part of the work, which I chose to end up making it a big piece of what I do.
That's wonderful. And what's frankly there's so many wonderful things about the relationship that we've shared over the last 7-8 years. I remember the first time we went out to lunch, and we discovered that just sort of politically and theologically we're in very similar places.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was around Israel and Palestine.
That's right.
And so can you sort of talk about, this has been a central part of work that you have done for your entire rabbinate.
Right.
Can you talk about your involvement as a peacemaker in that conflict?
Certainly. My rabbinate is long enough now. I was ordained, even though I'm a second career rabbi, I'm getting up there. And so I was ordained in 1998, which means I've been a rabbi for 26 years. And those 26 years, I have watched as solution making as regards Israel-Palestine has evolved in terms of the vision that Jewish eyes can see, has evolved quite a lot over the course of those 26 years. My vision is relatively steadfast, hasn't changed a whole lot even when the circumstances have. I was a fierce advocate for two states, for two peoples with rights of self-determination for both, back when it was very unpopular in the Jewish world. Also when it became sort of the lingua franca within most of the, not all, but most of the organized Jewish world. Then it became very, it receded from being seen both among Jews and others as being viable, as being possible. Maybe the statute of limitations on that has run out. Now I think as this war over the last 6 months has risen, a lot more eyes focused on the impossibility of telling either one of these peoples, there's no room in this world for you. There's no room for you to chart your own course within your own home, within a place that you have indigeneity. Both do. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of historical fact. Both sides are happy to tell you that the other one doesn't. Both are lying. And so, as a peacemaker, you make peace. Peace is hard. You don't make peace with people you already have peace with. You make peace with folks who have been long-standing adversaries, who have a really different take on what the truth and what the story, what's to be centered in the story. And so when I look at that reality, I recognize that treaties are built on deep sacrifice. Two peoples that look at the pain that has been suffered over such a long period of time, recognizing the futility in reproducing that pain, and being willing to accept some, but not all, of what they feel entitled to, because they recognize that there's another party that feels entitled to it all. And so how do you get to peace? You get to peace by saying, I don't have to accept that your truth is the truth, but I have to accept that your truth is as true to you as mine is to me. And since I don't get to choose who you are, I don't get to tell you, although both sides are certainly doing a lot of trying to tell the other what the truth is right now, I don't get to retrofit you to my reality. So your truth is as true to you as mine is to me, which means I have to make concessions to your truth. I have to live alongside your truth, even if I think it's an utter falsehood, because that is how peace happens. To me, I would much rather have part of what I feel I am entitled to and watch the dying stop. And so this has been where my eyes have been fixed for a long time. And oddly enough, in this time that I think is making us all so deeply distraught, I actually am taking some hope from the awfulness of this moment. I am seeing the futility registering with more people. If you are among those who feel like you're watching, especially after yesterday, gosh, Hamas and Hezbollah, all of these are effectively Iran. So if you're among those who are thinking, well, this just seals it. Israel's right. There should never be a Palestinian state. How can they be trusted? I hope you like the dying, because that's what you're going to continue to see. And if you're among those who are saying, if only, as I watch this happening again, if only Israel wasn't there. Before there was an Israel, we didn't have to worry that this endless conflict would go on, and countless deaths and suffering and starvation, you name it. Can't they just go to other places or live alongside in one state in peace and harmony, recognizing that Israelis are never going to accept that as a solution? It's not what they went home for. I hope you like the death and dying, if that's your stance, because that's not a solution. That is prioritizing feeling right over the pragmatism of what will save lives.
Well, and what makes it even more complicated, thank you, I just sort of want to just pause. In fact, I think I'm going to pause just for a second so those words can sink in. For everyone, and I don't even like talking about both sides, because that's so simplistic, as you well know. The death and the dying has deep, centuries, even millennial old roots, and not just in conflict with each other, but just what has played out over thousands of years in that region. It has roots in the Holocaust. It has roots with the historic oppression and murder of Jews. It has roots in the Crusades and what Christians did in the name of religion, what we did. And one of the things that studies are telling us now is that we actually carry generational trauma in our bodies, and it becomes part of our response. And so on October 7th, it wasn't just reacting to a news event. And it wasn't even just reacting to a news event that, we had people that we knew and cared about and loved who were intimately involved with. That's enough as it is. It's also, I'm carrying this trauma from generations that is just being activated. So just as a pastor, as a rabbi, if you're able to, can you talk about October 7th and what that was like in your community and for you, and what it's still like now?
Yeah, that is such an important observation that you just shared, Mike, because the generational trauma is such a huge factor in the Jewish psyche. There's just no getting around it. The number one way in which October 7th, at least in the early days following the attack, was characterized in the Jewish community, and it's accurate, but you can just see how it is wrapped in generational trauma. The description was it's the single biggest day of death, of killing of Jews since the Holocaust. The minute you attach the Holocaust to Jewish souls, that's the shooting match. And yes, crusades, inquisitions, pogroms, Holocaust, all of this is bound up in the story of the Jewish people between the year 70 of the Common Era, when the expulsion and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, and Israel, the people Israel, I'm not talking about the state, I'm talking about the Jewish people, became a people living in exile, living always with some sort of a presence, I don't know about always, but certainly for the most part over all those years, some kind of a presence on the land that is now Israel-Palestine, but for the most part living dispersed all throughout the world in all kinds of different communities, including here. Between 70 and 1948, the lived experience of what is the definition of Jewish life in a world where Jews don't have an address is a horrifying thought to most Jews. It gets re-triggered with an incident like I shouldn't even say an incident like October 7th, because the reality is, in the history of the modern state of Israel, there is no event like October 7th. The closest analogy that some have tried to suggest would have been the 1973 war, and even that really doesn't, certainly the response necessary and real was itself, the event itself not as traumatizing as October 7th, not as destructive. Its response also not as traumatizing and destructive. It's the closest analogy. And I do want to point out, if we're lingering in close analogies, or the closest analogies, if anybody had come to you in 1973 while war was raging, Egypt, with help, launching an attack on the holiest day of the Jewish year in 1973, when the Israel Defense Forces might be asleep at the wheel. If anybody had come to you then and told you that in the space of 5 years, Israel would be in the process of establishing what would become a durable peace with Egypt, not always the warmest and fuzziest peace, but a durable peace where nobody on either party, by each other's account, is dying. If anyone had told you while that conflict was going on that 5 years later that would be the outcome, you would have said, it's impossible. There's just no way. Things are at their worst right now. There's no hope that you'd be able to see that. I believe that sometimes, and we've already seen it with 1973, that sometimes the solutions that are so obvious but painful to get to actually become more accessible when the futility becomes so obvious.
Yeah, and yet even that piece took leaders who were literally willing to risk their lives, and in some cases lost their lives.
That is a really important part. It is true that a necessary precondition of a solution to this awful conflict is leadership on both sides, with both parties, that are willing and capable, have the credibility and the courage to go back to their own people and sell part, not all, of what you believe you are entitled to. And presently, neither party has that leadership. Neither party is even close to having that leadership at the moment. So that is a disturbing reality, and one that we will have to transcend. We've gotten close a few times over the years, times where Israel's had that leadership, times where the Palestinians, in 2010, I had the great a journalist friend of mine in Israel enabled me to meet personally, one-on-one in Ramallah with the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority at that time at his office in Ramallah, Salam Fayyad. And I wrote about it in the LA Times because I came home so energized. He was such a remarkable leader engaging in extraordinary state building. When I went to Ramallah, I was like, this is what the state of Palestine is going to look like. I was met by well-trained, polite police officials showing me my way, thriving businesses, families out and about. It was a really encouraging glimpse of what might be possible. And of course, he ended up being undermined both by the Netanyahu administration and by the rest of the Palestinian Authority that wanted to pocket the aid money instead of using it for state building. So he ended up getting run out. He's now, I believe, working as a professor and an economist in the United States. But yeah, it's important to point out that it's not just Yitzhak Rabin. You know, there have been glimpses of that kind of leadership possibly surfacing among both peoples. We're going to have to catch that amazing exacta ticket of both peoples being able to produce leaders that have the credibility, the courage, and the willingness, perhaps, to go down in history as peacemakers that sometimes leads you, as what did Martin Luther King say the night before he died? Longevity has its place.
Yep.
Would love to live a long life, but I don't care about that now. I'm here to do God's will. Please God, that type of leadership might be producible for these two peoples, because you're absolutely right. It will be a necessary precondition.
Yeah. Part of what I see playing out as we have conversations, I want to talk about ceasefire in just a second, because you and I have had many conversations about ceasefire, is, you know, and I'm sure you've had this happen too in pastoral conversations, where I'm talking with someone and they're laying out the pain that they have, but then they really quickly go to, but there's all these people who have it worse off than me, why am I feeling, you know, and they try to discount their own feelings and the impact they have because there's people who have it worse. And one of the things I try to say to them is, somewhere in this world, there is one person who is suffering the most. And the logic you are saying says that's the only person that we need to care about healing. Because everyone other than that one person can say there's other people who have it worse. But we know that's not true. And the truth is, our trauma, our wounds, they're relative to us. They're all really real. When it happens to you, it's real. And, you know, part of what I see happening is that the other side's suffering, gets discounted because they're like, well, what about this? It's sort of the, you know, the whataboutism, instead of saying, how can we dive deeply into the healing? And so I want to sort of talk just a little bit, if you're up for it, about you have your own pain, but then also what has happened is, like, you know, we met in these progressive spaces, and you've kind of looked around and it's like, where are all the people who used to be standing with me? Who are now feeling, well, let me just sort of say, like, that's lonely. And so, you know, we were all standing for justice and the same thing. And now it sort of feels like people are like, well, no, I have to stand, if not against you, not with you. And what has that been like?
Horrible.
Yeah.
I want to say this before I attempt to address that question a little more broadly. I have deep, deep respect for your rector. We have not always agreed throughout these 6 months, and have spent a lot of time in deep, deep discourse with one another. Every single time that might have led to our separating from one another, he has doubled down in ensuring that this relationship gets deeper, because of the challenge of the moment.
And you have as well.
Not lesser. I have not found that very commonly, I'm sad to say. Far too many, it's 21 years I've been the senior rabbi at Baeck Temple. It's a long run. And it is heartbreaking the number of friends and colleagues and partners in the interfaith community who I assumed that would happen with. Many of whom I know longer than you, Mike, who I assumed that would happen with. It has not. So lonely, yes. Hurtful, deeply. And it shouldn't be extraordinary what you've done to double down on that relationship, but I'm here to say that it is. And I want to make sure that you all know that and hear that. Yeah, you can give a little bit of love to the rector. What I will say is I feel like it is, just in addressing the question beyond your and my relationship, what I feel is where I am attempting to make my heart wide enough to hold space for those who have disappointed me during this time is exactly where kind of was the nexus of your question, which is there is a deep human hunger to take awfulness and make it simpler than it is. I understand why folks want to pick a side. I understand in the Jewish community why people want to pick a side. They're wrong to pick a side, but I get it. Because doesn't it feel better to say it's their fault? And it's simpler, that make them pay. Problem solved. That's where the disappointment is coming from. It is exactly right. I am experiencing my own trauma, and there is no room for everybody else's because look at my trauma. It's so big, and it's so awful. And yeah, I get that there are those who are suffering their trauma, but they're actually to blame. And so therefore, doesn't have to be a whole lot of room in my heart and soul for them. We already talked about what solutions look like, and they don't look like that.
No, and frankly, I have a great deal of sympathy for people who are in active trauma, and the trauma is so great on any side of this that they cannot see past it. Because that's just what happens to us as human beings. It's those of us who, I mean, we all have our own trauma, but we're not directly impacted. We don't have friends and family. We're not, people like me.
Yeah. And
it just is that, we're actually the ones who need to be able to stand with everyone and say, what does healing look like? Yeah. And that's been such a challenge. So let's talk about ceasefire, which is when, the response to the massacres of October 7th happened. We really quickly here at All Saints began calling for a ceasefire and a release of all hostages. And frankly, and I guess I'm learning more and more that I have a history of thinking things are not going to be a big deal, and then they end up being a big deal. And I'm thinking, we're a church. We're calling for an end to war. This feels like stop killing each other. This should not be a controversial position. And yet it became this intensely controversial position, and also an area of disagreement, for me. And part of why I wanted to have you here is I still absolutely believe we need a ceasefire now. I look at what's happening there, and we can talk about this words, and I see it as a genocide. I believe that this needs to stop now. And I so appreciate how you have not let me have a reflexive position. That you have just what you sort of said, that there is such a temptation to simplify. And you have challenged my position by saying it's not that simple. So how is it not that simple?
So, a lot of puzzle pieces there. First off, why don't we talk about genocide? You will find that most in the Jewish community will look upon October 7th as the realization of a long articulated desire for genocide of the Jewish people. Hamas has a written charter. The charter includes a desire to kill me, not just to eradicate Israel, but for my death and my family's death. Last I checked, being on record in print as the mission of my organization is the genocide of another people, probably ought to be said out loud that that's what that is. So when October 7th happened, and the level of the depravity wasn't just the death, because yes, if we're counting deaths, it's pretty abundantly clear who's done more of the dying in these 6 months. And I am going to do nothing to diminish the significance of the suffering in Gaza, because it would be morally abhorrent to do anything to diminish the suffering in Gaza. This isn't about math. This is about when you look at what took place and who were the targets. It was not a military operation. The people who live in those communities, whose names you may now be familiar with, the kibbutzim that are close to the Gaza border, the great majority of those Israelis are the big peace activists. They live down there because they have wanted to demonstrate that living in mainland Israel, not occupied Israel, although recognizing full well there's a giant conversation about when does the occupation begin. I'm not going to go there right now. I'm going to simply say that the Israelis who are attempting to live alongside Palestinians in peace, I have visited those communities, and I have met these inspiring Israelis, and they were targeted because they were proximate, because they were Jews. And they were killed because they were Jews. And they were raped because they were Jews. And they were dismembered because they were Jews. They were burned alive because they were Jews. We did not agree that there were calls for a ceasefire on October 8th when Israel hadn't begun to lift a finger to respond to that atrocity. To me, a call for a ceasefire on October 8th is a statement that Israel does not have a right to defend itself. That people who have an attack waged against them of that sort, if whatever powers that be might determine that their existence or presence is wrong, that they are therefore entitled, in fact expected, to suffer that type of brutality, and it's their fault. So I reacted with real pain to the early calls for a ceasefire. Some have noted that one of the organizations that I'm a recent past chair of, and now I'm still on its board, a rabbinic organization that works towards human rights all throughout the world, Truah, recently in the early part of April, it might have been in March, actually. Yeah, it was definitely in March. In March, published a new statement calling for a ceasefire, a negotiated ceasefire that included the returning of the hostages. And the argument that was made in that, I was a part of drafting this statement, and obviously also signed it, signed by many hundreds of rabbis across North America. The argument was that after months of this awful conflict, if there's one thing that has been demonstrated conclusively, the Israelis are demanding two things that are not congruent with each other. They're demanding a return of the hostages who were taken on October 7th, and they're demanding the absolute eradication of any smidgen of Hamas. And if you look at the one proven method that actually got hostages home on both sides, and if you're talking about, although I wouldn't characterize a lockstep those who are in Israeli prisons all as hostages, I have an objection to that characterization as well. Doesn't mean not some are not there rightly, but the point is that exchange that took place in the midpoint of the war has been the only thing that answered that one clarion cry from the Israelis. And so I believe I'm standing with the Israeli people in calling for a negotiated mutual ceasefire that leads to the return of hostages. Unfortunately, Hamas turns down every invitation for such a ceasefire. I will not call for an independent ceasefire that one side has to cease its fire while the other side continues to plan for the genocide of the other. And so, this is going to be an ongoing evolution. What it is we believe to be, in terms of the immediate conflict, the best response, the most humane response. But no, I have a hard time imagining that if a rogue militia that was on record as saying that the death of America is what is correct based on all of the atrocities, frankly, that the American government has been party to, if it crossed the border and did to 1,200 San Diegans what was done to the Jews on October 7th and took 250 of them home with them, that we would characterize a response to that as a willful. Genocide is not about a lot of people dying. Genocide is about the willful intent to eradicate the existence of another people. We may have to agree to disagree for a long time, but I see one party as actively genocidal, the other engaging in acts that range from military defense to impossible to defend, and everything in between. When I consider that my own government here as an American once carpet bombed Fallujah for no purpose whatsoever, and has not been called a genocidal regime, I have a hard time with Israel being characterized as a genocidal regime.
Yeah, well, I will just say for me personally, I would call the U.S. a genocidal regime for that, and so I think that's part of the challenge. The example that you used about the San Diegans is essentially that could also be example, and it's been called this as sort of as relating to 9/11.
Yeah,
and we had.
Some in Israel referred to October 7th as Israel's 9/11. That's
9/11.
another characterization like the almost Holocaust one.
And our country's response to that was both a trauma response and an opportunistic response to do something we wanted to do anyway.
Correct. Which I would characterize as the callous disregard for life, and advancing a geopolitical ambition.
Right.
I don't believe that the intent of the American government was to end the existence of the Iraqi people.
No, although I believe that there were people in the American government who were utterly indifferent to that.
I completely agree with you.
So,
I don't believe that that's actually the legal definition of what a genocide is.
That's absolutely fair enough. Yeah. I think part of my challenge is that some of the words that we've heard coming from Benjamin Netanyahu and some of his ministers have seemed very much like that combination of acting out of trauma and political opportunism that we decried and still decry after 9/11 when our government did that. And in fact, this church was calling for a ceasefire then, so yeah.
I hope you didn't bring me here to defend Benjamin.
No, I didn't.
I'm not here for that purpose.
As long as you don't make me defend the U.S. government, I think we're all okay.
I really hope that's not what I was invited to do.
No.
You'll be deeply disappointed.
So.
This Israeli government obviously has, in order for, it should seem familiar, a prime minister attempting to remain out of jail by doing whatever was necessary by hook or by crook to retain power. If this sounds familiar to you, you know what it looks like, and we're familiar with it too as regards the state of Israel. This coalition includes elements in it that not only have they never been a part of any previous Israeli government, they are descendants of Mayor Kahana, who the extremism was so reviled by the Israeli people that, in point of fact, they were barred from government service back in the late 1980s at the time of the rise of Kahanism. So now you've got folks who are holding significant ministerships in the Israeli government, including control over the police. Yes, Senator Chuck Schumer, who certainly can't be accused of being an enemy of the state of Israel, has demanded new leadership for both peoples, and you'll get no argument from me.
We need to wrap up. I want to end, first of all, just saying thank you so much for coming and allowing us to sort of take our conversation public, which
Absolutely.
I appreciate. Let's end, look, where do you find hope? And you touched on this earlier, but where do you find hope, and how can we come together to work for that hope?
Yeah, I said it before and I'll say it again. I don't believe that if you look at history clinically that there's a sort of a linear process that leads to peace between warring parties. If you look at the great conflicts over the course of human history, sometimes there's this sort of unevenness. It looks like the NASDAQ. The thing is getting absolutely worse, and that's the moment where the breakthrough is actually possible. There's been an attempt to dissuade me from within and beyond the Jewish community for decades to abandon the hope for two states. Why? I mean, most recently, it's impossible. With all those Israeli settlements, it can't be done. They've made it a geographical impossibility. I'm like, I don't really believe in geographical impossibilities. I think that we on the left oftentimes kind of accept defeat a little too easily. You know, to talk about a completely different topic, I don't want to waste, we don't have a lot of time on it, but as a metaphor, you know, the right in America watched in 1973 as Roe v. Wade became the law of the land and really never accepted defeat. We do a lot of accepting, oh gosh, there's too many settlements. I guess this solution that we once believed in can't be done anymore. Human will is a funny thing. And it makes extraordinary things possible. I like to believe that just as humans are capable of creating extraordinary brutality and suffering, such as we are seeing right now, we have also seen humans rise to transcend the worst of possible problems. And I am hoping, praying, and advocating these days around the idea that this moment is making it, I hope, glaringly obvious. The Palestinian people are not going away. Their demand for self-determination is not going away. It doesn't matter that their leadership right now is, from at least the Gazan people leadership, is a worldwide noted terrorist organization that it directly causes their own suffering as well as the suffering elsewhere in the world, certainly in Israel. The Palestinian people have a right to self-determination, and they're not going to stop demanding it. So too the Jewish people, and both have indigeneity on that land. The sooner that becomes obvious, and it's just, I think it is obvious, it's just there's a hunger to decide who is responsible. If you like the death and dying, you will continue to advocate for one side over the other. If you are interested in peace, you will take a look at your history books and you will recognize that some, not all, is what peace is made on. And I am hearing, at least within the Jewish community, a hunger for two states before that was once very popular, became very unpopular, is rising once again, and I hope in the broader community as well, because this is where my hope resides.
Keep working together?
Absolutely.
There you go. Our friend Ken Chasen, everybody.